Good morning, everyone. Today's screencast is going to focus again on ethnic minorities in World War II, but this time around we're going to focus on non-white ethnic minorities. So we're really going to focus on Mexican Americans and their experience during the war, and then also Native Americans and their experience during World War II. So there's going to be a lot of images, a lot of pictures I have to show you about some of the events that take place. So it's not that heavy as far as terms and definitions. It's more kind of the story this time around. So we're going to first take a look at Mexican Americans during the war, and we're going to focus on a specific event known as the Zoot riots. And there's a lot of very interesting overtones that go along with the Zoot riots. So they take place in 1943 in Los Angeles. And so the first thing I want to take a look at is exactly what does this phrase refer to? What is a Zoot suit? So you're looking at three men here who are wearing what will be considered a Zoot suit. So it's kind of like a very baggy suit that's kind of oversized, an oversized jacket, oversized pants. And it was kind of a style that started to develop in the late 30s, early 40s. You saw it predominantly in African American communities, and then also some other minority groups like Mexican Americans would kind of adopt the style, and some Filipino Americans. And even in some cases, white Americans will also kind of adopt the style. Now, where the problem comes in and where the issue comes in is during World War II, things are kind of at a heightened intensity. And what we talked about in class was the mentality of the era is rationing. You're only supposed to use a certain amount of meat. You're only supposed to use a certain amount of gasoline. And a lot of key things were rationed during the war. And so one of the big things that was rationed was wool. And so you were supposed to try and limit the amount of wool that you used, and the clothing was, like I said in class, the styles of the clothing got tighter. And so what happens here is that these young teenagers, they're Mexican American teenagers in Los Angeles, they continue to wear this style, and it's going to cause some real friction between the Mexican American population in Los Angeles and the military population in Los Angeles. Because what you're going to have here is in the West Coast in this time, you're looking at a map here of where the riots actually took place, but in the West Coast at the time, as well as the East Coast, you have a lot of military personnel are stationed there. So you have bases in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, all along the West Coast. You also had bases all along the East Coast. We had a major base in New York, in Brooklyn at the time, the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so they had a big Navy Yard here in Los Angeles where a lot of naval personnel were stationed and also a lot of Marines were stationed. And so what you're looking at here is where the riots broke out. And so the big areas of the riots are like here in Chavez Ravine, and some of these other areas kind of around this part of Los Angeles. You might have heard this name before. This is where the LA Dodgers play, is in that same area, same general area. So what was the riots about? What exactly happened here? Well, there's kind of been during the early 40s, 42, 43, there starts to grow tension between the military personnel population, which happens to be predominantly white men, and then this local teenage Mexican population that are adopting different styles, particularly the Zoot suits. And where this clash kind of erupts is over the military personnel deeming these people to be unpatriotic for what they're doing, for wearing these very baggy pants, and kind of almost flaunting that, they don't care about the rationing. And that's kind of how the military personnel perceived it. And so what starts to happen in this situation is they start to go out and target these individuals and beat anybody up who they perceive to be Mexican or a Zoot suiter or anybody who's kind of associated with this crowd or this group. And so some real riots break out here, but there's real racial overtones to the riots. And so there's another picture of some people who will be considered Zoot suiters from the era. And so there's another picture. So what they did, the sailors kind of went out there with baseball bats, not really guns, but baseball bats, and they were just kind of assaulting anybody who they saw or they deemed to be a part of this group. And it went on for a couple of days here in Los Angeles. And what ends up happening here is that the police come in eventually, but not in the way that you would expect. They don't start arresting sailors. What they start to do is arrest the Zoot suiters, even though they're really not the ones who are causing the disturbance. And so what the sailors would often do is kind of strip them, take all their clothes off, because of the fact that they were flaunting the wearing the excessive cloth. That was kind of like their almost like their retribution that they were trying to give to them for flaunting and breaking the laws. So when you look at this riot, it does remind me of other riots that have happened in American history. If you look back, there's quite a few riots in American history that have racial overtones to them. So you could look at the Zoot Suit riot and say, well, it was strictly about the sailors being upset that they were not abiding by the rationing rules. But you can also say that, well, it had a lot to do with the fact that who was not abiding by the rules, the fact that they were Mexicans, and that maybe the sailors did not see them as true Americans or fitting into the society. This happened in 1919 when you had these massive riots after World War I, which were largely racially based, and in a lot of northern cities in Chicago, black and white riots happening. And it's happened since then, too. We're going to talk about riots that happened in the late 60s that were racially based. This made me think of another riot that happened in Los Angeles, which was the Rodney King riots. And Rodney King, he was beaten by police officers, and they went on trial for it, and they were acquitted. And what happened in South Central Los Angeles, it kind of erupted into a major riot. So I guess an event in your lives that was similar, you saw a reaction to it, but not a riot. You saw a protest, was the Trayvon Martin case. But in Los Angeles in 1992, it erupted into a riot. This had extreme racial overtones also, because what happened in this case was that African Americans who predominantly lived in South Central Los Angeles were very upset, and they started taking their anger out on anybody who was white that happened to be in that neighborhood. They were getting attacked, dragged out of their cars, beaten up, killed. And they also went after other groups who they kind of deemed hurting them in certain ways. So they attacked a lot of Korean businesses in their neighborhoods. So this picture is of Koreans on top of their business with rifles, kind of defending their property. So this has happened in American history quite a few times. These riots where race plays a big role. Now, on the flip side, a much more positive experience. Well, before we get into that, let's talk about this idea of the good war. So World War II is kind of seen in history and is talked about a lot as like quote unquote the good war. And what historians mean by that is that people have this look at World War II that everything was positive that came out of it, that we were fighting for good in World War II. We were fighting against fascism, we were fighting against the Nazis, against totalitarianism, against imperialist Japan, and we were on the right side in World War II. And you can definitely understand where people are coming from with that perspective. But what you want to understand here is that there's things also going on underneath. I believe somebody in class asked me about, well, was there anybody who was against the war in the United States? And yeah, there was. It didn't eliminate all of the discrimination, all the problems within the United States. And so you see that here in the Zoot Suit riots. And the other big question you want to think about is, when does patriotism go too far? When is it stifling of a democracy? When can you not speak out? When can you not express yourself? Do you have to be super patriotic in a wartime period? And all these questions kind of come up, I think, in a interesting way in the Zoot Suit riots. So what I was saying before, in a much more positive way that we can talk about, a minority group during World War II is with Native Americans. So Native Americans, they joined the military during World War II. But I want to focus in on a particular group, they're known in history as the Codetalkers. And there's a really good movie about this, a World War II movie. If you ever want to take a look and rent it, I believe it is called Codetalkers. And so this is designated a specific group of people, a specific group of Native Americans from a specific tribe. So the Codetalkers were from a tribe called the Navajo tribe, which was a very small tribe. And at this point, there's not that many of them left. I believe there's only about 300 of them left in the world when World War II broke out. And so a big thing in World War II and in every war is trying to code and keep secret what your troops are going to do before they do it. And so there's whole branches of militaries designed to breaking other people's codes. And so in America, this gave the United States a huge military advantage because what they did was they took advantage of this Navajo tribe. The fact that they had a language that none of the Europeans knew about or understood, which would make it almost impossible to decipher it if they just used the language and encoded the language. So basically what they did was they used the Navajo as their code, the language, and they coded a language that nobody knew in the first place. And so it was virtually impossible for our enemies to decipher what we were doing on the battlefield. And so what they did was they put these members of the tribe into different units, and what they would do is kind of decode messages for people, from one unit to another unit or from headquarters to the unit, so they knew what was going on. And so I can't kind of stress how huge this is to give the United States a wartime advantage, because if you think back in history to languages, languages are very difficult to figure out when you have nothing to base it off of. So the best example of that is with the ancient Egyptian language and hieroglyphics. Until they found the Rosetta Stone, which had 4 different languages on it, and so that you could kind of know, some of them were known languages, so you can compare what the hieroglyphics meant and the translation, it's very, very difficult to decipher a language. So if you learned about the Indus River Valley in global history, their language has still not been deciphered. So it's been 5,000, 6,000 years since they had that language, and it's still not been deciphered. And so, huge advantage for the United States. And where you see other countries come up with codes that don't work as successfully, it gives them a big disadvantage. So, for example, the Germans during World War II, their code was based off of numbers. So they would just come up with a very long chain of numbers, and they had to actually if you were working for the German military, you had to have a machine that would decode it for you and kind of tell you what these things meant, what these long lines of code meant, almost like in a computer. If you're familiar with computer programming and they code things for programs, it was similar to that. And so they had a very, very long coding system. Now the problem with that is it's easier to break that down. There's some kind of formula, and what the British and the United States did was they devoted whole teams of computer analysts and scientists to breaking the code, because breaking the code is huge. It gives you an advantage in war. And the British were able to break the German code pretty early on. They developed a machine called Ultra, which was able to decode the German code. And this came in huge in the Battle of Britain, which happened from 1940 to 1941, which we talked about in classes when the Germans were coming over basically London and a lot of other major British cities and just bombing it nightly. What the Germans didn't know is that the British knew when they were going to bomb and how they were going to bomb the cities, because they had cracked the code. And so in a wartime situation, this can mean the difference between winning a battle and losing a battle, life or death for your civilian population, for your military population. And so the fact that we had this diversity within the country, we had Native Americans with languages that were little known or the Germans didn't even know that this group really existed within the United States, gives the United States a tremendous advantage, on the battlefield. So you kind of see the two sides of it, that the diversity in the country sometimes causes tension and riots and racial hatred and problems, but then it could also kind of be a huge strength of the United States, the fact that we do have so many people from so many different backgrounds. All right, guys, so more screencasts to come later in the week.